Alpha Legion, it's always been a problem to try and get that colour shift effect, but thanks to the chameleon paint by Green Stuff World, makes it a doddle. So we first prime the miniature black, and then we use a mixture of ink plus gloss varnish, and we coat the entirety of the miniature. Then we choose our chosen colour shift paint. In this instance, it's Celestial Azure. Beautiful name for a beautiful colour. This colour has a hint of purple to it, so the colour shift goes from blue to purple, unlike what you may have seen previously, especially on the Forge World site, of blue to green. Now there's a very specific reason why I chose the purple over the green. There's some unofficial law knocking around that you could identify the factions within the Alpha Legion by what kind of colour shift paint their armour has. If it's purple to blue, then it falls on Alfaris' side. If it's green to blue, then it's Omegon. But as with anything with the Alpha Legion, it's open for interpretation, and let's face it, we'll never know a definitive answer to this. But we've seen the Alpha Legion depicted in the past with different sets of armour in the Black Books, so I believe it's Conquest, where they appeared. There's even some mention of them being in sable armour, so black armoured marine. I'd love to do black armoured Alpha Legion force, but that's a video for another time. That's another painting black video. In the meantime, we return back to our marine and we take our good old trusty stippling brush. That is a brush that I've cut, so something that's coming to the end of its shelf life. I knock off the majority of the paint until it really struggles to impart off the brush. It's somewhat of a dry brush consistency. There's really not that much pigment on the brush at all, and whatever is there is very, very dry. In this particular case, I use silver by scale 75, and that's from the air range, and I concentrate on hard edges of the armour. Wherever you'd think to add a edge highlight, that's where I concentrate this, because that's where the most amount of chipping would occur. Once that's done, I add another layer of Celestial Azure across the entirety of the armour plate, and voila, we have a colour shifted marine. To finish off the effect, I want to mat the shadows down ever so slightly. I want to reinforce the shadows in some areas underneath the legs, underneath the gorget, places like that. The very, very darkest shadows. So I'm adding a layer of Druchii Violet with some life colour thinner. I'm only adding the life colour thinner to make sure that the airbrush doesn't dry up and it doesn't we don't get encounter dry tip. It's a common problem amongst all hobbyists, dry tip. Yep, that was a deep inhalation of breath to stop myself from plunging this patron into Toilet Teamer. You come here for the colour theory, for the craft, not for the comedy. Okay, so Druchii Violet, base of the shoulder pad, and you can see how it brings out the purple shift. I want to locate the purple in the shadows primarily. When I twirl this around, the blue exists on the upper mid-tones to highlight, purple in the shadows. The airbrush I'm using is a 0.35. It's not the finest of detail that you can get, but I don't like using the airbrush for very fine detail. This gets me generally in the area where I want it to be, and for Space Marine armour, this is well, you don't want anything smaller because you'll encounter dry tip, you'll encounter spluttering. Okay, to finish off the painting process, the armour, I'm taking Celestial Azure with my brush, a stippling brush, and I'm stippling this from the mid-tone to highlights. This is to add a few flecks of incidental damage. The Druchii Violet dries matte. Here we are reintroducing some of that colour shift element back into the upper mid-tone to highlight. And indeed the mid-tones, wherever we can add a few scratches here and there. It's to break up the armour plate, it's to make it look worn and lived in, something that's been a part of a battlefield rather than something that's pristine and come off that's come off an armory line. Now, by no means should you think of this as the definitive way to paint Alpha Legionnaires. As always, these are just guides. These are jumping off points for your own creativity. I would highly advise that you try a few other colour shift paints, especially I believe it's Psychotic Illusions that goes from blue to green. It's a fantastic colour that you may want to consider using for your own experiments, or if you want to look at one of the many black tutorials we have on here, I would recommend instead of recommend substituting purple instead of blue for the upper mid-tones for the pigmentation. It will make sense when you get to the black videos themselves. Instead of adding something like Incubi Darkness or Turquoise, instead add a purple. Because when you look at the 3rd edition codex, I believe Alpha Legionnaires were painted black but highlighted with like a lurid purple. It's a really nice twist on the traditional colour scheme. Then you use the green decals and even some green scales, if I remember. You can do some really unusual things with the Alpha Legion. To finish, for the silver areas, I've used a heavy dry brush of silver across all the metallic areas, so things like the gun, the backpack, etc. And then I've washed it all with Nuln Oil. For the gun and the barrel, I wanted to give it somewhat of a reflective surface, but as with all good snipers, you want to dull it slightly. I've used graphite on top, and then I've added a pinch of ivory for that dull highlight. I do not want to use any more white on top. I do not want to add any specular highlights. So specular highlight is a dot highlight of pure white. I want to avoid that as much as possible. Any colour that I will be introducing, ivory is the very, very top highlight I will be using. And pay attention to how I actually use the brush here. So I use the side of the brush to highlight the edge of the barrel, and then the edge of the casing, and then the barrel itself, I use the very tip, and I kind of swathe it back and forth to give a broken, fractured appearance. Again, microchips, micro detailing. Okay, for the anything that has a gem or an eye lens, things of that nature, I add white into the base to begin with, and then should be coming up soon. Oh, I've used a touch of green there, touch of green and black, so boreal tree green into the very darkest shadows to define the faceplate. I spend a few extra seconds just defining the faceplate because, as the old adage goes, faces and bases. If you want to conserve time on your project, make sure that you concentrate and add a few more layers to the face and to the base. And it's a bit like reading a word. You don't read every single character, your eye skips across it. You can do a pretty similar thing when it comes to your Marines. Okay, Arthen Jade is used to block in the lenses, and then blue-green from Vallejo is used as our first highlight. I add 2 dots of pure white up top, and then I finish with a smile. If you do want a further breakdown of this, have a look at the Ultramarine tutorial, the infantry tutorial. Indeed, most tutorials that has an eye lens will have some form of the smile technique. And big grin at the bottom of the eye lens, and 2 dots up top. Not only does this give a more reflective quality to the lenses, to the glass, it also lets us understand the volumes that we are seeing. Now, the ARM monitor will not have the same rounded brush strokes as the eye lens up top, where our brush stroke, especially with the blue-green, is a lot more rounded towards the base, whereas there it's a lot more straight lines and taps with the brush. For the cables, we've used Blood Red by Scale75, then Iroko to highlight. Before the Blood Red is dried, I've mixed a bit of Iroko in there to give it a wet blend. Okay, next up, to polish the metallics, I'm using pure silver. I'm adding an edge highlight to the metallic areas. This portion of the video will be made to be a standalone release. I thought it was such a good opportunity to show you how to wet blend cloaks using nothing but a brush that I wanted to include it as part of this tutorial, and I'll also break it off and put it later on. Okay, so we begin by adding flat black across the entire surface of the miniature, and before that has dried, we are using graphite. Pay attention to, I'm using a number 1 brush here. I'm sorry it is a little out of focus, but you can see the broad brush strokes of what I'm trying to achieve. Perhaps not so much there. Graphite is used to define the biggest, largest areas of light. Now as the paint starts to dry, I can define the edges a little bit more. Please pay attention to how I manipulate the brush. I've splayed out the bristles slightly, and I'm running it along the highest highlight, along the edge of the... And you can see the paint hasn't quite dried yet. I can still mix it into one another. Pinch of ivory is mixed into the graphite. And again, before the paint has started to dry, before it's dried, I'm trying to give that sense of cloth. Okay, wipe off any excess from the brush. Excess paint from the brush. Add some graphite. Grab some black. Now this technique is excellent at large areas, large flat areas. It adds interest, it defines the volumes of the cloak. It's also nice to practice this kind of brush control. I've primarily used non-coloured greys here because the miniature itself is so colourful anyway. I did not want to start adding things like green into the mixture or red, any colour of your choice, purely to have it as a backdrop to the azure, the celestial azure. Okay, now the paint has started to dry slightly. I could take some ivory and a touch of graphite. And I'm rolling it across the edges of the miniature again to give it a cloth-like appearance. The edges of the brush are splayed out slightly to create that threadbare look. And that's it. Now don't expect this stage to look quite as perfect. You can add glazes, intermediary glazes in between to tidy things up, but that's it. That's the video. Thank you so much for watching. Here is what the finished miniature looks like. Please let me know if you use this tutorial on your own miniatures. I'd love to see what this spawns. I'd love to see what this tutorial produces. Thank you so much. I'll catch you in the next vid.